History as it happens, September 21st, 2021. Osama bin Laden.
Support that the United States has been providing the resistance will be strengthened rather than diminished so that it can continue to fight effectively for freedom.
Kenyan television is reporting that a van packed with explosives caused that blast. There are unconfirmed reports that an Arab-speaking suspect is
These acts of terrorist violence are abhorrent. They are inhuman. We will use all the means at our disposal to bring those responsible.
Sorrow at the explosion involving the U.S. naval vessel Cole in Yemen.
If, however, we determine that terrorists attacked our ship and killed our sailors, then we will not rest until we have tracked down those who are responsible.
That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
When he traveled to Pakistan to assist the Afghan Mujahideen, no one in the United States knew the name Osama bin Laden. And when he declared holy war on America 15 years later, few noticed. But soon after, this obscure, wealthy religious fanatic would become the most wanted man in the world, whose crimes triggered a series of events that have left a legacy of violence and misery across the greater Middle East. A conversation with bin Laden biographer Peter Bergen next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
That U.S. Navy SEALs stormed Osama bin Laden's hideaway in Pakistan and killed him. They also seized...
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men.
In 1997, Peter Bergen, along with reporter Peter Arnett and their CNN cameraman, visited the mountains of eastern Afghanistan to shoot an interview. The man they spoke to was very tall, rail-thin, soft-spoken, and comported himself like a cleric. He had a feline presence, quite different from the angry, table-thumping revolutionary we expected. That is how Peter Bergen describes a man who would change history in his new biography, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. But at the time, no one really cared about this strange fellow living in a cave, declaring holy war on America.
Our interview got virtually no pickup. It just went into the void. And I think that was because, as far as anybody was concerned, it wasn't clear that he'd really done anything.
Our conversation with Peter Bergen is coming up in a moment. You know, we just produced 3 episodes dealing with the post-9/11 world. One was titled The Law of Unintended Consequences. In it, we hear from Ronald Reagan speaking at a White House news conference in 1987 with Yunus Khalis, a leader of the Afghan Mujahideen.
The goal of the United States remains a genuinely independent Afghanistan, free from external interference.
I have no doubt that the U.S. promises of support and commitment to the Afghan cause will be honored in the future as it has been in the past.
There were no TV cameras around when Khalis warmly welcomed Osama bin Laden back to Afghanistan in 1996, the decade after the creation of al-Qaeda and bin Laden's service to the anti-Soviet jihad. No, the CIA did not create al-Qaeda, but the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan helped turn Afghanistan into a cauldron of jihad in the 1980s, the cauldron where al-Qaeda was born. After bin Laden escaped Tora Bora at the end of 2001, he was protected in Kunar province by warlord Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, whose faction received hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. distributed by Pakistani intelligence to fight the Soviets. These are not the only examples of blowback covered in Peter Bergen's excellent book, and you're probably aware of some of the others. Bin Laden himself believed the U.S. would implode after 9/11. Instead, the Bush administration launched a war that dealt al-Qaeda devastating blows in Afghanistan. But Bush had his own fantasy view of reality, that by invading Iraq, the world would be safer from terrorism. The 2003 invasion wound up sending more young Muslim men racing to join the ranks of militants than bin Laden could have imagined in his wildest dreams. So what is Osama bin Laden's legacy? This man whose crimes led to 2 decades of ruinous wars, who was wealthy but decided to live in caves and mud houses, who doted on his kids and loved his many wives while plotting the deaths of innocent people. Peter Bergen is a vice president of New America and a CNN national security analyst. He's written or edited 9 books, including the aforementioned The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. He is an authority on international jihad, and we're honored to have him here today. Peter Bergen, welcome.
Thank you, Martin.
So we met once before, although I'm not sure you would remember this. You were in a grocery store. I recognized you as you were doing your shopping. I approached you, introduced myself, and told you how much I enjoyed reading your book, The Longest War, which came out about a decade ago. And because, of course, you were doing your shopping, I didn't have time to ask you a question. What was it like interviewing Osama bin Laden in 1997 in Afghanistan? You do reference this in your book, of course. What impression did he leave on you? You know, journalist to journalist. I'm wondering what that was like in 1997.
Yeah, he was quite mild-mannered. We didn't really know what to expect to him. Anybody listening to this knows considerably more about bin Laden than we did at the time. I wasn't entirely sure what he was going to look like, to be honest. And he was 6'4", rail thin, comported himself like a cleric more than a table-thumping revolutionary. The people around him treated him with a lot of respect. They called him Sheikh, which is an honorific term. They hung on his every word. He seemed very serious. The people around him seemed very serious. Those were my impressions. I mean, he declared war against the United States. He was really a foreign policy critique of the United States, not a critique of the United States for its freedoms or anything like that. You know, we were with him for, I would say, a little over an hour, and then he left.
This was the year prior to the embassy bombings. At this point, he had some standing in the Arab world, in the greater Middle East, in the Muslim world, or not yet?
I think so, because, you know, Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by Saudi officials in 2018 in Istanbul, had done the first major profile of bin Laden in 1998. And so, you know, I think he was well known in the kingdom, in the Saudi kingdom as a result. And then when he moved to Sudan in the mid-90s, he was releasing a series of communiques which were very critical of the Saudi royal family. Those got him a fair amount of attention in the Arab language press, to the extent that that press is not controlled by the Saudis, so the independent press. So, yeah, I mean, I think he was getting press coverage in the Middle East. He wasn't at all known in the United States. This was his first television interview when we met with him. He'd done a couple of interviews with Western reporters, Scott McLeod of Time in 93 in Sudan, and also with Robert Fisk of The Independent, both in Sudan and in Afghanistan. In Sudan, he was presenting himself as sort of a successful businessman, which was partly true, but he also had this secretive effort to attack American targets in Yemen and Somalia, which he only really went public with once he was in Afghanistan in exile there. He dropped any pretense that he wasn't interested in a violent conflict against the United States.
Yeah, at this point, he would be referred to as a terrorist financier. But he had also, I think you mentioned it, declared war on the United States by this point. But I think the reaction, at least among those who noticed in the United States, was, well, who is this guy?
Yeah, our interview got virtually no pickup. It just went into the void. And I think that was because, as far as anybody was concerned, it wasn't clear that he'd really done anything. You know, one of the people that I profile in the book is Gina Bennett, who's still at the CIA today. And she was the first U.S. government official to write an official classified warning about bin Laden in 1993. She fingered him for an attack on a hotel in Yemen in 1992, where American servicemen were being housed on the way to Somalia for the humanitarian Operation Restore Hope, launched by the George H.W. Bush administration and then continued by Clinton. So some people, a tiny group of people in the U.S. government, were already pretty concerned about bin Laden, but his public profile was as somebody who was essentially calling for the overthrow of the Saudi monarchy, but not leading al-Qaeda or a terrorist organization.
You open your book by raising a question that you've dedicated much of your professional career trying to answer. Why did this man, the son of a billionaire Saudi construction magnate, create an organization dedicated to the mass murder of civilians when he could have chosen, of course, a different life? So now that you've written this short biography, what is your best answer?
Yeah, these why questions are difficult because you can't really get to the answer why completely. because we can't live inside somebody else's head. What I do in the book is answer the how question. How did he get there? I don't engage in much armchair psychologizing in the book because I'm not a psychologist and because I don't think it's that helpful. But I mean, there are some facts that are clearly important in his life. His parents divorced when he was 2. His mother was an Alawite, which is regarded as a heretical form of Shiism by Orthodox Sunnis. And of course, he grew up in the most Orthodox Sunni place you can grow up, which is Saudi Arabia. His dad died when he was 10. He had 54 siblings, none of whom chose the path that he chose. By his own account, that turned him more towards religion. He memorized the Quran. By the time he's a teenager, he's a very zealous teenager. And that might have been a way of becoming more holier than the Pope, as it were, because of his mother being an Alawite, the sort of marginal position he had in his own family. He was the only son of one of his father's 20-plus marriages. And when he encountered 2 Spanish girls in Oxford when he was studying at summer school when he was 14, he described his mother as a concubine, which is kind of an interesting construction. And then, of course, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. That was a very transformational event for him. And he went there and he raised money, and then he fought personally against the Soviets at a base that they called al-Qaeda the base, which became al-Qaeda the organization over time. Each of these steps along the way, it was a process of radicalization that took decades, and none of it was inevitable. And there were off-ramps that were presented. Bin Laden's brother-in-law came to visit him, and when he was in Afghanistan, told him not to run his own military operation there. Jamal Khashoggi visited him. Sudan suggested he do an interview where he renounced violence. That didn't happen. He kept getting more and more radical until finally he's pushed out of Sudan in 96 and he arrived in Afghanistan. And from that point forward, he abandoned any pretense that he wasn't involved in trying to overthrow the Saudi royal family and also attack the United States.
Many of his siblings, as you mentioned, embraced Western culture. He spent some time in Europe, Spain. I believe he was in England.
Well, he was in England.
So he met the Spanish girls in England. I believe he visited the United States once. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, his knowledge of the West is very cursory, and we know from his first wife that he visited the United States for a couple of weeks in 1979. We also know from bin Laden that he visited Oxford for summer school when he was 14 for 2.5 months. And when offered to do the trip again, he said, I don't want to go. He said the British are morally degenerate. And that's kind of, I think, his view of the West. So his knowledge of the West was pretty superficial in terms of his firsthand experience of the West. And I think that's partly why he miscalculated about the 9/11 attacks. For some reason, he thought that the United States wouldn't respond in the way it did and that it would be a relatively weak response. And he believed that the United States was a paper tiger, just like the former Soviet Union was, and couldn't withstand 2 or 3 blows of the kind that were delivered on 9/11. Well, he completely got that one totally wrong.
A miscalculation of epic proportions. We're going to get into that in a little bit. About bin Laden the person, he was a religious zealot, first and foremost. He believed that Islam, and I think you've said this in your writing, Islam was at the heart of al-Qaeda.
For bin Laden, he was this religious zealot. And then his brother-in-law, Jamal Khalifa, who was murdered under mysterious circumstances in Madagascar in 2007. It's not clear if it was a robbery or maybe he was killed by the United States. He told me that bin Laden really believed that God would punish him if he didn't do the things he did. I thought that was an interesting insight. And then Noman Ben Othman, who was a leader of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was allied to al-Qaeda and now is turned very much against bin Laden, told me that bin Laden has a rather specialized, unusual view that no one is immune from being attacked in his holy war except extremely observant Muslims. And that view was amplified by Abu Jamdal, bin Laden's bodyguard, who released a very interesting book, first in French and then in English. Bin Laden was asked by Jandal, why did you kill so many civilians in the Africa embassy attacks? And bin Laden sort of laughed and said, well, they were warned, meaning the CNN interviews, ABC News interviews, and that anybody near an American target should have known. And it didn't really matter if they got killed because he'd done his due diligence to warn them. And then Abu Jandal, who had spent time in Kenya, knew that there were a lot of Muslims living in Kenya, said, well, what about the Muslim civilians? And bin Laden said, well, we timed the bomb so it went off at 10:30 in the morning on Friday. And if you're an observant Muslim, you should have been in the mosque. And if you're non-observant, it was your fault.
What's interesting about your book is the number of times you relate conversations between bin Laden and people close to him, people who were bitterly opposed to the United States and Western culture who objected to bin Laden's interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith, who told him, listen, you can't kill civilians. But bin Laden, well, you explained his own rationale. He would point to passages in the Quran that he claimed justified what he was doing.
You know, and I mean, there was internal opposition in al-Qaeda to the attacks, both from the military commander, Saif al-Adil, concerned about what the action might be, concerned about what it would do to the Taliban, very legitimate concerns, it turns out. And then Abu Hafs al-Mauritani, who was the religious advisor, said, as you point out, that these attacks were against Islam because they were killing innocent civilians. So, but bin Laden ignored all that. He's one of those people who had great faith in his own judgments. He'd just shop around for people in al-Qaeda who agreed with him. And if you disagree with him, at the end of the day, members of al-Qaeda had sworn a personal oath of allegiance to bin Laden, and he was in charge. He was too polite to sort of have an argument with somebody, but he just ignored their advice.
He didn't seem to raise his voice very much. So it appears that the most important decision he made in his life, in his early life, was to go to Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan after the 1979 Soviet invasion. He wasn't necessarily recruited there. He had his own money. He had his own decision-making process. Some people did object to him going, but he winds up there. And he eventually mythologizes his own role on the battlefield, as well as the importance of the foreign jihadis who go to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Can you talk a little bit about that myth building?
Yeah, but there's no denying that bin Laden himself fought bravely against the Soviets. It was almost suicidal bravery. I mentioned his brother-in-law, Jamal Khalifa, went to visit him when he was in Afghanistan. And Jamal Khalifa was also his best friend in university. And basically he said, look, this is madness. You're going to get a lot of people killed, because he was recruiting these idealistic Saudi university students to come, and many of them from Medina, to come and fight at this base called al-Qaeda in eastern Afghanistan. And they had a fairly contentious argument about this. So bin Laden certainly fought the Soviets personally and bravely. But the question is, did it make a difference? The answer is no. Estimates of the size of the Afghans fighting, the low estimate is 175,000 Afghans were fighting the Soviets at any given moment. And the highest estimate of the number of Arabs actually fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan is 300. So you don't need to be a military expert to see that no, 300 Arabs could not possibly make a difference to what happened during the war. And they didn't. In their own minds, they'd helped to defeat a superpower, but their contribution was pretty minimal. What they did do is they brought sizable private contributions to the Afghan Mujahideen, which is important. And they kept the story alive in the Gulf, and the Saudis donated $3 billion, matching the CIA dollar for dollar, and I think that was not unimportant, but it was not the way they construed their own role.
And those 300 fighters, that was at any given time, not the same 300 people over the course of the decade.
Well, but still, that was the max number of fighters that at the height. Usually there might be 100, and there were a lot of Muslim volunteers came, but most of them came to Pakistan, and they didn't go into Afghanistan because it was extremely dangerous and difficult to get there. So those volunteers, people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, they were doctors, they were helping support the Afghan Mujahideen either through medicine or fundraising or doing journalism. There was a jihad magazine that bin Laden funded along with Abdullah Razam, his mentor during this period, which was an important tool for recruiting people and fundraising. But most of the recruits didn't go into Afghanistan.
So let's address the myth of a CIA bin Laden al-Qaeda connection or cooperation.
Yeah.
The CIA, of course, did work with jihadis. The United States funded the Afghan Mujahideen, but the CIA at the time, and no evidence has ever come up, right, to establish a connection to bin Laden.
There were maybe half a dozen CIA officers in Pakistan who were funding the Afghan Mujahideen, but they were funding it through the Pakistani military intelligence agency, ISI, which basically decided where the money went. And the money went to Afghan groups they favored, such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's still a player in Afghanistan, who's an Islamist. But CIA had no contact with the Afghans, let alone with the so-called Afghan Arabs that bin Laden was one of the leaders of. And as you say, there's no evidence has ever emerged. We're 4 decades later. There's no piece of paper. There's nothing. It's hard to prove negatives, but there's no evidence that it's true. And actually, al-Qaeda has denied it. CIA has denied it. And some people might say, well, of course they would deny it. But the point is there's nothing to substantiate this. I think the CIA did make mistakes. I think they were too trusting of the Pakistani military intelligence service's decisions about who got the money. So Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's an Islamist militant, not a member of the Taliban, but in that kind of camp, he received the biggest chunk of CIA assistance, and CIA never really objected to that. But that's a very different question than did the CIA fund bin Laden? And bin Laden, of course, had his own money. I mean, he self-funded what he did. And he also raised considerable amounts of money from donors, including from his own family.
Well, I think some people who make this claim today are trying to make a point, right?
It's always made as an assertion. It's a one-sentence assertion without any evidence proffered.
You mentioned Hekmatyar. As you point out in your book, he helped protect bin Laden after he fled Tora Bora. He's still around today. Yeah. Those years, that decade of the 1980s, still so relevant based on what's going on in Afghanistan now. So I'd like for you to address the following. While the CIA did not create al-Qaeda, I think we should discuss U.S. responsibility for helping turn Afghanistan into a cauldron of jihad during those years. As you and other journalists like Ahmed Rashid have pointed out, the U.S. sent billions to the Afghan mujahideen. But Pakistan recruited, according to Rashid's count, more than 30,000 jihadis from across the greater Middle East and elsewhere between 1982 and 1992.
I think that is erroneous. I mean, based on my own pretty deep reporting on this question, 300 Arab Afghans fought in Afghanistan, and maybe 10,000 went to Pakistan to support the effort. I think that Rashid's figure you're citing is from maybe 20 years ago when he wrote his book. I'm basing my numbers on people like Abdullah Anas, who was central to this effort in terms of the recruiting people from around the world to support the Afghan jihad. So, I mean, the numbers are much smaller, which isn't to say that the bigger issue of Afghanistan becoming a cauldron of jihad. But, you know, Zbigniew Brzezinski, when he was alive, was asked a version of this question. He was asked, I think, by Nouvel Observateur, the French newspaper, what about the fact that after the Afghan war that you supported, that it was a sort of incitement of jihadism? And Zbigniew Brzezinski basically said, winning the Cold War was more important than a bunch of stirred up Muslims. I'm quoting him. Winning the Cold War was what the CIA was supposed to do. And the loss of the Soviets in Afghanistan, I don't think can be underestimated as a reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union couldn't defeat a lightly armed guerrilla force on its own borders, what did it say about its ability to put down protests in Eastern Europe and control events in Eastern Europe? And I think that everybody saw the Soviet pullout as they understood the Soviet military couldn't really sustain this war. And I think that had a very important psychological effect on people in Eastern Europe and on the Soviets themselves.
Well, thank you. Thank you for correcting the figure to 10,000. But the point Rashid made and that others have made, one that I agree with, was that none of the intelligence agencies at the time, including the CIA, took time to consider the danger, the unintended consequences, the law of unintended consequences of gathering so many people together in one place.
But I'm sympathetic to the fact that they didn't. The mission from President Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey was, first of all, let's make this Soviet occupation of Afghanistan unpleasant. And then in 1986, they went from, let's actually try and win this war by giving the Afghans Stinger missiles, which ended the Soviet air superiority and ultimately produced the result that the agency wanted, which was the withdrawal. And there wasn't much thought given to like what the after effects might be. I think that's just life. When you have a big goal in mind, second and third order consequences are not foremost. And Regina Bennett, who I mentioned already, you know, she noticed at the end of the Cold War that there was an unintended consequence, the one that you point out, which is these Afghan Arabs were going back to Algeria and Bosnia and Chechnya, even countries like Burma, and they were joining armed groups and they were fomenting violence. And so there were certainly people noticing, but it was a very small group of people at the time. These armed groups hadn't really done much. But then veterans of the Afghan war then sparked a civil war in Algeria, which killed 100,000 people. So there were consequences. No one was looking that far ahead.
Ronald Reagan referred to the Afghan mujahideen as freedom fighters. He met Mohammed Yunus Khalis at a White House news conference in 1987. That news conference is still available on YouTube. It was Khalis's men who greeted, I learned this from reading your book, Khalis's men who greeted bin Laden when he arrived in Afghanistan in 1996.
Yeah.
What a coincidence. So bin Laden gets the idea in his head that he's responsible. He and his men are responsible for defeating the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And this kind of propels him forth. He believes that he could deliver the same kind of blow to the United States. which was a fantasy, but he pointed to actual events to justify this worldview. The pullout of the Marines from Beirut under Reagan, the Black Hawk Down incident. There were other instances that he interpreted as signs of U.S. weakness, right?
Yeah. I mean, he cited those in our interview for CNN in 97, and he cited them repeatedly. And he looked at the Marine barracks attack that Hezbollah carried out as sort of as a model for what he planned to do. He sent people to Somalia to train Somalis who were fighting the United States presence there in 1993. And they seem to have trained Somalis to bring down American helicopters. The fog of war is not clear who brought down those helicopters, but certainly al-Qaeda was sending top military trainers to train Somalis. And then the United States pulled out after 18 American servicemen were killed. So he pointed to those, but he kind of got the wrong lesson from them, which is the United States doesn't really have any interest in Somalia, nor does it really have tremendous interest in Lebanon. And so pulling out, it's not like this was a huge defeat for the United States. Most people didn't even notice. But for bin Laden, this was a model that on 9/11, the United States would pull out of the Middle East as a result of the attacks. And that, of course, backfired spectacularly.
Some of bin Laden's grievances were shared by more than a few people across the greater Middle East and the Muslim world. There is much to criticize about U.S. foreign policy, but he also embraced half-truths and exaggerations about what was actually going on. For instance, the U.S. occupying Saudi Arabia. It was the Saudi royal family, as we know, that invited the U.S. Army into the kingdom to protect its borders against Iraq after Iraq invaded Kuwait. Can you talk a little bit about bin Laden's worldview not being entirely tethered to reality?
Yeah, well, I mean, because he found the Saudis to be illegitimate, he wouldn't have agreed with your premise that the Saudis, it is true, the Saudi government invited the United States to put its troops. It wasn't like we were occupying. We did it at the invitation of the Saudi royal family. But since bin Laden found the Saudi royal family to itself be illegitimate, their invitation to the United States was also illegitimate in his mind. For bin Laden, the fact that the Saudis had renamed the kingdom Saudi Arabia in 1932, that itself was illegitimate. I mean, the Arabian Peninsula in bin Laden's mind was not owned by the Saudis. It was the Holy Land. And so going back to this religious beliefs, when the Prophet said on his deathbed, let there be no two religions in the Arabian Peninsula, bin Laden took the introduction of American troops as contravening that deathbed admonition of the Prophet. So for him, it didn't matter if the Saudis had invited the troops or not. It was against Islam in his view.
And especially because there were women among the American troops as well, right?
Yeah. According to his son, that was particularly irritating to him.
So bin Laden's goals preceding 9/11 and with the 9/11 attacks was to expel the U.S. out of the Middle East, even if it meant killing innocent people.
Yeah.
But he seemed to have no broader vision for society. It was mass murder, and then what, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. There's, we know what bin Laden's against, but what was he really for? And that's part of the issue with the Taliban also. I mean, the Taliban want to impose Sharia on the population, their version of Sharia, but either bin Laden or the Taliban have a really positive vision of the future. I mean, I think they sort of feel like we're going to create this Sharia law society and people will be pure and everything else will take care of itself. Bin Laden in particular never sketched out what the future would hold beyond getting the United States out of the Middle East and its client regimes crumbling. He didn't have a positive vision of the future.
And he believed the United States would implode. The political disintegration were the words that Lawrence Wright used in his book, The Looming Tower. And you alluded to this in your book as well. He thought that was it. He had won.
Yeah, I think he labored under a number of delusions. I mean, one of the themes of the book is the extent to which he set up this base in Afghanistan next to a Soviet military post. It was not a sensible military decision. The Afghans fought a guerrilla war, not a fixed base conventional war against the Soviets. He then presided over a battle in Jalalabad, which was a conventional battle in 1989, lost a lot of men. Again, not a smart idea. Implemented the 9/11 attacks. They backfired. He didn't have a plan B for what the United States actually did, which was coming in with a relatively small CIA special forces footprint allied to Afghan allies and overthrowing the Taliban in 3 months. So he consistently had ideas that really didn't work out. He had a very strong belief in his own views of the world, and the facts didn't really get in the way of that.
Maybe just fanatical. In the 1990s is when the CIA and FBI counterterrorism officials start tracking and studying bin Laden. You mentioned the first report was in 1993, a classified briefing. In 1995, the CIA sets up Alex Station in the basement. Who worked in it? What was its mission? And third part of this question, if you don't mind, I think we have to also remember what U.S. foreign policy priorities were at the time. And in the last 20 years, we've been consumed with international terrorism, right, as priority number one. But in the post-Cold War years, that was not the priority.
Counterterrorism was regarded as a backwater at the agency. And so Alex Station formally started working January 96. Mike Scheuer ran it. He recruited mostly women. He thought they were better analysts. It was a mix of operators and analysts. It was a virtual station directed at one person, bin Laden. It's the first time such a station had been created. It focused on bin Laden as a financier of Islamic extremism. Alex Station was not the main priority of the agency at the time. You know, that was the idea that one person could have an influence on events was not widely held.
One person with fewer than 200 people on his roster on the eve of 9/11, as you point out. As it turns out, Alex Station, with Michael Scheuer, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, his character was one of the main characters in the Hulu series, The Looming Tower. As it turned out, they were right about bin Laden, and they tried to get the Clinton administration to sign off on any number of attempts to either capture or kill bin Laden. What is your view on that? Did the Clinton administration, including the Pentagon, which seemed reluctant to go ahead with these things, did they miss a legitimate chance to get him then?
Well, there's a big debate about it. I mean, it was pre-9/11, so the stakes were a little bit different. Mike Scheuer certainly thought there were many opportunities, and he also told people that this guy's going to kill a lot of Americans. But each time the shot wasn't taken, either because concerns about the quality of the intelligence, the possibility of collateral damage. And part of our problem was, of course, that we closed our embassy in 1989 in Afghanistan. It's interesting how history is now repeating itself. So we were kind of blind as bin Laden and al-Qaeda expanded there, reliant on local tribal assets for intelligence, which was very perishable because you didn't have armed drones giving you persistent surveillance. You only had the possibility of cruise missile strikes and then unarmed drones very late in the game. So the shots were not taken. You know, each of the opportunities I unpack a bit in the book, and there was always sort of a compelling reason that was produced about why the shot shouldn't be taken. In one case, bin Laden was at a hunting party with a bunch of Emiratis, and it turns out that probably a bunch of Emirati princes, because there was a Emirati C-130 military aircraft by the hunting camp in southern Afghanistan, which would indicate the presence of Emirati royal family. You didn't want to incinerate a bunch of Emirati princes if the intelligence that bin Laden was there was imperfect, but the shot was never taken.
Some of these plans or proposals never even made it to Clinton's desk, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I found out there was something called the Covert Action Security Group, I think it was the name. I mean, there's a group of senior CIA officers that would assess these plans, and they, in some cases, would say, well, there's only a 30% chance that this will succeed. So George Tenet would just sort of say, well, if there's only 30%, we're not going to do it. I think it was called the Covert Security Action Group, would review the plans. Adding to the confusion is there was a real disconnect between what the White House thought it had authorized and what CIA heard it had been authorized. And there was a memorandum of notification, highly classified, which has never been made public, about whether to kill or not bin Laden. The White House believed that they'd authorized his assassination. The CIA thought they'd authorized that he could be killed only in the context of a genuine capture operation, which, of course, made everything much harder.
In your footnote, you mention historian Philip Zelikow. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. Yeah. His reading of the document was that it was unambiguous. The CIA had the authority to kill bin Laden.
Yeah, I say that in the footnote. Another staffer also read this document, which has never been publicly released, and she had the same view. You know, that said, a bunch of CIA officers were interviewed by the CIA Inspector General in a report that was only completely declassified, I think, in 2012. The report in a classified form came out in 2005, and they were pretty adamant that they heard something else. And I quote Kofor Black, who was head of Counterterrorism Center on 9/11, which is, if Clinton really wanted to kill bin Laden, he would have issued the following order, which is kill Osama bin Laden, signed President Bill Clinton. because there would have been no ambiguity about that. So CIA officers strongly felt that they didn't have the authorization to kill bin Laden without it being in the context of a snatch bin Laden operation.
If they could even find him. What I do find interesting is that you and other journalists were able to find bin Laden, but the U.S. intelligence community couldn't. I don't know if that's a fair comparison.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I mean, it's a fact.
Among the myths you address in your book, bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Of course, this myth was pushed by members of the Bush administration to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
And that lie really worked. 70% of Americans continue to believe that Saddam had a role in the 9/11 attacks 2 years after 9/11, even though there was no evidence for that. And surely they didn't get this idea from nowhere. They got it because people like Vice President Cheney kept talking about it. To make the case for the Iraq War, you had to say that Saddam had a weapons of mass destruction program, and he was allied with groups like al-Qaeda that could take these weapons and attack the United States. I mean, that was the case that was made. I mean, at the time, I knew that there was really no evidence that Saddam and al-Qaeda were allied. I couldn't disprove something about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction program because I didn't know enough of the facts. And ultimately, it was only by invading Iraq that it became clear that he didn't have these weapons.
And the invasion of Iraq probably sent more young Muslim men into the ranks of militant groups than bin Laden himself could have recruited had he lived to 100 years old. Do you agree with that?
I say in the book, the Iraq War saved al-Qaeda, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. I mean, al-Qaeda, by the account of Abu Musab al-Suri, who was one of bin Laden's close associates, he said that of the 1,900 Arabs who were in Afghanistan on 9/11, 1,600 of them were captured or killed. I take that seems like a very good number. So al-Qaeda was really on the ropes, and then along comes the Iraq War, and this is exactly what bin Laden had predicted. The United States attacking a Muslim country in the middle of the Middle East, and an oil-producing country. It seemed to fit with what bin Laden's rhetoric had long said. So, and of course, al-Qaeda in Iraq didn't exist in Iraq before the invasion. And al-Qaeda in Iraq then, of course, became ISIS. And then also the Iraq War instigated, I think, what really the biggest change since 9/11 in the Middle East is the rise of sectarianism. And a number of factors there, which is Mohammed bin Salman running this very kind of Saudi nationalist monarchy in Saudi Arabia, and the Iranians and their ambitions. But the Iraq War really sparked a sectarian civil war in Iraq, which has spread to Syria, and also we see it now in Yemen. And so I think the Iraq War is the original sin here. Bin Laden miscalculated on 9/11. The United States grossly miscalculated on how the Iraq War would play out.
And researchers at Brown University's Costs of War program have estimated that as a result of the global war on terror, 1 million people have been violently killed over the past 20 years. So none of this has worked out for anyone. Bin Laden wanted the U.S. out of the Middle East. So does it stand to reason that he might have been disappointed when the United States invaded Iraq? Although, as you mentioned, it did help his recruiting.
Well, disappointed, but he hated Saddam. He even told us in 1997, when the camera was off, he told Hamid Mir, a Pakistani journalist, he used a word that I can't even use about Saddam. So he had very dim views of Saddam long before anybody thought that they were allied. So he would have been happy about that, but he wouldn't have been happy about the U.S. occupying such an important country in the Middle East. But then he would have been delighted by al-Qaeda in Iraq and what they did. He didn't like their tactics. They were attacking the Shia, and he wasn't interested himself in fomenting a sectarian civil war. But I think that on balance, the Iraq War was something that he was quite happy about.
So after 9/11, what was bin Laden's standing among ordinary Muslims in the world?
Yeah, I think it was pretty high in countries like Pakistan and other countries in the Muslim world, but over time it faded. And I think it correlated with lack of support for suicide bombings in the Islamic world, which, since so many of the victims in Pakistan, Iraq, and other countries were local Muslim civilians, I think that the attitude towards suicide bombings, which was al-Qaeda's signature tactic, declined. And over time, I think bin Laden lost a lot of support. And then by the time he was killed in Abbottabad, and a decade later, he didn't put up a fight. He died in the suburban compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. There were no really big protests about his death. I think he'd become somewhat irrelevant, and his appeal had faded.
He seemed to sense that as well, as you describe him in his compound, as the Arab Spring is underway.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big discoveries in the documents that were released in the bin Laden compound that I used was only released by the Trump administration in 2017, sort of 6 years after those documents were recovered. And that was the bin Laden Family Journal, which documented bin Laden and his two oldest wives, both of whom had PhDs, their response to the Arab Spring, which they understood was the most momentous event in the Middle East in centuries, quoting bin Laden directly here. And yet his ideas and he were playing no role. So they started gathering every night before and after dinner to talk about the events of the day. Bin Laden was watching a lot of Al Jazeera. His family would kind of interview him about the events of the day and then take down notes about his thoughts, because this was all being directed towards writing a speech for bin Laden that would allow him to take charge of the Arab Spring. So they spent weeks talking about the issue, and huge excitement in the bin Laden family household. His two oldest daughters seemed to be writing the diary contemporaneously, 228 pages, handwritten in Arabic. It wasn't intended for publication. So it's written in kind of a elusive and note-taking kind of style. And I had Nadia Wadat, who's a scholar of Islamist thought. She translated it and helped interpret it for me. They kept saying to bin Laden, you've got to get out there with a speech, because, the masses haven't heard from you and you've been separated from the masses for so long and you need to speak. Bin Laden's big idea was that he would call for a council of religious scholars, undoubtedly Taliban-style religious scholars, who would advise the new governments of the Middle East. And that was his big idea. And he recorded a video or audio to that effect, which was released 2 weeks after he died by al-Qaeda. But no one in the Middle East really wanted this advice or was looking for this kind of advice. And the bin Laden family certainly understood. At one point, they said, is it a problem this happened without jihad, referring to the peaceful revolutions, largely peaceful revolutions in the Middle East? Bin Laden's response isn't recorded. And at one point, they also say, look, al-Qaeda isn't really being mentioned in any of this. And bin Laden answers kind of defensively, well, some commentators are mentioning al-Qaeda. So they were aware that this was not something that they'd instigated or had any role in, and they wanted to insert bin Laden into it. They believed if he delivered the right speech, he could somehow take control of the Arab Spring, and this was just another delusion that he had.
The Arab Spring protesters were not interested in living under the type of world he envisioned. He always had a media savvy. I remember after 9/11 when another bin Laden video was released. It was major news. I want to ask you about a point you made about his standing in the Muslim world after 9/11. What should Americans conclude about the fact that bin Laden was a sympathetic figure or even a hero to some in the Middle East after 9/11, and that there was a sense among some Muslims that the United States had it coming for its foreign policy?
Well, there's a fair amount of anger in the Middle East just generally about U.S. support for authoritarian regimes like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, U.S. support for Israel. I mean, these are the themes that bin Laden talked about. They resonated with a number of people in the Middle East. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, I don't think they resonated with the majority of Muslims, but they certainly resonated with quite a number of Muslims. And then bin Laden himself had this somewhat interesting backstory, the son of a billionaire who fought the Soviets, and that made him sort of a heroic figure. So that combined produced these kind of favorable ratings, but they faded over time.
I want to go back to Tora Bora before we wrap up with a final question about Afghanistan right now. When we talk about near misses or near hits, I thought it was such a cruel irony that the day bin Laden escaped from Tora Bora, General Tommy Franks is working with Donald Rumsfeld on a plan to invade Iraq after Franks had turned down requests to send in Army Rangers into the mountains of Tora Bora to potentially catch bin Laden in December of 2001.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason I can say that in the book with some certainty is Ayman al-Zawahiri released in 2015 his own account of the Battle of Tora Bora, and he escaped from the Battle of Tora Bora with bin Laden, by his account, at 11 p.m. on December 12, 2001, which I always knew sometime in that 2-day time window, but it's interesting. Zawahiri is an eyewitness to this event. And that is the same day that, as you say, that Franks was briefing Donald Rumsfeld about the Iraq war plan. And the World Trade Center pile was still smoking. I went back to double check if that was true. It was still smoking on December 12, 2001. So the architect of 9/11 was escaping from the battle at the same time that the next war was being contemplated, in which Saddam Hussein had no role in 9/11. So, I mean, ironic is a sort of too light a term for all that.
No, not the right term. And what was really puzzling was Frank's reasoning. He did not want to repeat the Soviets' error by sending in a small army, a small group of special forces operatives into the mountains of Tora Bora, whereas, of course, the Soviet Union had a full-fledged invasion and destroyed the country, while at the same time he's talking about invading Iraq with a large army. It didn't make any sense.
It doesn't. I mean, and there was this concern about replicating the Soviets' experience in Afghanistan. Well, sending 800 Rangers into Tora Bora, which is 6 miles by 6 miles, for the limited purposes of trying to catch bin Laden, that's not going to replicate the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There was a lot of risk aversion at the Pentagon at the time, because the last time the United States had engaged in a conflict was the air war over Kosovo. There were no casualties. And then previous to that, there was a Somali operation where 18 American servicemen were killed. So there was kind of like a risk aversion at the Pentagon. The Soviet experience was sort of a convenient excuse not to send more troops. And we also now know that Jim Mattis, who was a Marine brigadier general at the time, from his new book, he says that he put up a plan to the Pentagon asking if he could send a good chunk of his 1,500 Marines who were in southern Kandahar to set up observation posts around Tora Bora and try and cut off escape routes. And that plan just sort of arrived dead on arrival at the Pentagon. So it's strange that the United States missed this opportunity, because bin Laden was there for quite a period of time, probably a couple of weeks, where he was known to be in Tora Bora.
I'm not a gung-ho military interventionist, but I often wonder how, and I'm sure you have too, as have others, if bin Laden had been caught in Tora Bora at the end of 2001, if much of the past 20 years might have been avoided. It's an impossible question to answer.
Yeah, it's a what-if question, which I posed in the book. After all, it was all about getting bin Laden. If the Taliban had handed over bin Laden, they probably would still be in power, would have been in power for the last 20 years. And I think some of the energy would have gone out of the whole war on terror, the whole war in Iraq, if bin Laden was captured, killed, and much of al-Qaeda was destroyed at the Battle of Tora Bora. I think some of the arguments in favor of the Iraq war, in favor of continuing the war against the Taliban, might have dissipated.
I am puzzled about your stance. You still believe the United States needs to maintain a military presence in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, we had 3,500 troops there. Crucially, we had 7,000 allied troops in addition, NATO troops almost entirely, and 16,000 contractors, 6,000 of them were Americans. And that relatively small force was enough to kind of keep a fragile status quo in place, with the Afghan elected government sort of survive. I mean, look, 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago, the Afghan elected government controlled every provincial capital, and now they control none. There are 34 provincial capitals in Afghanistan. So the collapse happened very quickly. It was wars are a battle of wills, and they're psychological. And the Afghans put down their arms, not because they're cowardly or bad people, but because they've lived through 43 years of war, and they all want to keep their heads on their bodies. So President Obama had the same dilemma that President Biden had, which is he wanted to go to zero. In the end, after a lot of discussion in the White House, he left 8,400 troops there. So whether the number is 8,400 or 3,500 or 5,000, from a military perspective, there's some difference between those numbers. But from a psychological perspective, the Afghans simply did not want to hear that we were just leaving. Because when we left, all our NATO allies left, and then all the contractors left. And so how do you keep the Afghan Air Force without the contractors to keep the service to planes? So it was, I think, an unforced error by the Biden administration, which I think they'll live to regret, because lots of developments in Afghanistan can change the policy. The Taliban can engage in ethnic cleansing, which they did before 9/11. The Taliban could kill Americans or dual nationals, or jihadist groups could attack an American target in the region. Europeans trained in Afghanistan could carry out attacks in Europe a couple of years from now. There's a lot of things that might change the equation. And Obama changed his mind in Iraq in the summer of 2014, when the Yazidis faced genocide and when Jim Foley and others were murdered by ISIS. He put troops back in, and there were, at the height, I think there were 5,000 American troops. There's still 2,500 troops in Iraq, by the way, right now. They were just relabeled non-combat troops, which is what we could have done easily in Afghanistan if the Taliban were not observing the peace agreement, any element of that with us. They didn't break from al-Qaeda. They didn't negotiate with the Afghan government a real peace negotiation. So we could have just said, Biden could easily have said, they're not abiding by the terms of the agreement, so I'm not going to abide by it either. But he chose another path, and I think he really wanted to get out. And it was a kind of convenient fig leaf to kind of sort of blame the Trump agreement. He had to sort of observe it. I don't think that's true.
20 years, more than $2 trillion, tens of thousands of deaths, civilians, and, as you mentioned, the Afghan security forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties fighting the Taliban in recent years. I don't see, and of course, no one really needs to pay attention to my opinion. I'm no expert on this, but I don't see a military answer to the problem of international jihad.
Well, the Taliban saw a military answer to their problem, which is they're going to seize the country. I mean, I think this idea that there's no military solution ignores the policy is not one of defeating every jihadist in the world. The problem is one of managing the threat so it's not an issue for the United States. And I think that over the past 20 years, we did a reasonably good job of that. And now we're just sort of throwing in the towel. And I think there's these groups, al-Qaeda can't attack the United States like it did on 9/11, but it certainly can attack American targets in the region. Westerners can certainly be trained by al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups to carry out attacks in the West. I mean, we saw that in the summer of 2014 in Iraq and Syria. Why would it be any different now in Afghanistan? It may not be exactly the same, but it's going to be more similar than different. So that's my concern going forward.
Well, Peter Bergen, the author of The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, thank you for your time today.
Martin, thank you. Thank you for reading the book, and thank you for this thoughtful interview.
To all of our listeners, I recommend Mr. Bergen's book, and I'll also encourage you to check out the recent 3-part series of History as It Happens about the post-9/11 world. You can download all the episodes at historyasithappens.com or wherever you get your podcasts. On the next episode of History as It Happens, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we heard the words "never forget," a saying usually associated with the Holocaust. As hard as it may be to believe, the Holocaust is being forgotten or poorly taught or deliberately erased in the U.S. and Europe. The state of Holocaust studies. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.